Love it. Well, hey, my name is Ryan. If we haven't had the chance to meet yet, I get the joy of serving as the lead pastor here at the Co. And I am so glad that you're here this Sunday of all Sundays because we are jumping into a new series called We the Co. And I've been I told some people the other day, or earlier this week, I've been preparing for this season, quite honestly, since before you met me and I met you. So when you were just a website on the internet and I was getting to know you, we dated online before, it's how that works now, So even in that, right, I was there's content and stuff I've been processing about in this We the Co series that I've been sitting on for 5 months. I told somebody, or a bunch of people this week, I said, I've been here for 3 months, but this week feels like my first week here because I'm just ready to go and so excited for this series ahead. Let me tell you, I feel like we are in kind of a pivotal point in the life of our church that I quite honestly am really excited about. Many of you know this. If you're newer to the church, you may not know this yet. We'll fill you in a little bit, but if you've been around for a little while, you know this. We've been in a season of kind of transition for really the last, I'd say 18 months, right? In the last 18 months, we changed locations. We moved into this facility here. We changed the name of our church about a year or so ago, right? We had a lead pastor transition. You guys were crazy enough to hire the guy with the biggest baby face you could find, and give him up here. We just had a lot of shift and change over the past, year and a half. And so as we kind of look forward, I think it's important for us to kind of pause and go, hey, let's talk about the future that we desire for our church and the church that we feel like we're meant and designed and called to build together. So I'll say this, for a lot of people, if you've been around for a while, you're probably, I'm excited to talk about that. If you're newer in the room, if this is your first Sunday, you might be like, oh man, I feel like I just showed up to a family meeting, what happened here? And let me just say this to you right out of the gate. Of all the weeks that you could start hanging out with us at the Co, you picked the very best one. Because I'm going to tell you this, you're going to learn more about our church over the next 4 weeks than you probably would in a year's time. So you're going to know real quick, we're either your people or we're not, and you're just going to know, and that's good and that's helpful. So you pick the best time to jump in and kind of explore and engage with us. You're going to learn a ton about us over this series if you're newer with us. But man, I'm so excited for the season ahead. And I'll say this though, right out of the gate. I'll just acknowledge this, right? Every new season in the life of a church or in the life of work or in the life of your family, every new season anywhere, right, brings new questions. Anytime there's a new season, right, and you're coming out of transition into something new, it's exciting, it's optimistic, there's so much opportunity, and there's also so much that's unknown that you're trying to figure out, right? So every new season comes with new questions. So I want to tell you real quick, just kind of what I would say are the top 2 questions that I've gotten since I've been here for the last 3 months. Of all the questions I've gotten, you guys have been very open and very awesome to just share your questions, ask me thoughts, share your thoughts, what have you. It's been wonderful. But the top 2 questions that I've gotten since I've gotten here, the first one is this: hey, where do you think we're going to be long term? Because we changed locations a year and a half ago. We were in a more permanent facility. Now we set up and we tear down every Sunday here. And a lot of you are like, hey, where do you feel like we're going to be long term? That's a great question. Great question. Second question that I get the most, right? Hey, what do you think about our church's name? I'm always I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I don't know. My own middle name is Dale. I've been carrying that one around for 35 years and I haven't changed it yet. So I don't know. I don't know. Sorry, if anyone in the room is named Dale, I am real. Dale just left, I think they said. Dale just. But hey, let me say this right out of the gate, right? Those are great questions. Where and what? Those are great questions. They're important questions that we need to think about over the season ahead and process and make decisions around and lead forward. I get it. It's good. But those aren't the most important questions for our church right now. And those aren't the biggest questions that we face. And those aren't the questions that we ought to be thinking the most about right now in this moment and in this season. I would just say to you kind of right out of the gate, the most important question that our church faces now is actually the most important question in every season of our church. The most important question we face is who? Who? Not where, not what, but who? And specifically, who are we meant to be and who are we meant to reach? As a community of faith, as people journeying in life together, who are we meant to be as a community here? And who are we meant to be building this church for? Who are we meant to reach? And so that's where we're going to focus our time in this series. We're not going to focus a ton of time right now on where. We're not going to focus a ton of energy on what. We're going to focus our time and our energy on who. Now, today I want to kind of kick off this series by talking about something that I feel like the church at large has valued for hundreds of years, and quite honestly, it's something that most of us, if not all of us, value pretty significantly in our life, and that's the value of certainty. In fact, I would say we all kind of gravitate and drift towards certainty. You want to be certain about things. I want to be certain about things. I don't like not knowing things. I like knowing what the future looks like. I like knowing what different areas of my life look like. I like being certain about as much as I can, right? Like if I go on a road trip, if it's longer than an hour, it doesn't matter how many times I've driven on that road trip. What's the first thing I'm doing when I get in the car before I put on the playlist, right? I'm pulling up the map. I'm putting it on the dashboard. I'm checking that ETA, and about every 3 minutes, I'm checking that ETA again just to see if I shaved another minute off, Come on. Do it too, right? But I want to be sure that I know that I'm going the right way, and I want to be sure that I know when I'm going to get there, right? When I've told you some of this around Christmas. When I make gift lists for Christmas or for my birthday, I usually start with kind of the big list, like all the things I would want, and then I pause, and this is so bad. I pause and I go, now how much do I think they're actually going to spend on me? And then I whittle down the gift list. Like that was just a draft, that was just the private draft. Then I whittle down the gift list to just those things so I can be certain that I'm going to get the things that I want most. Come on, you've done that. Come on. Some of y'all got Pinterest boards. You got the public Pinterest board and the private Pinterest board. And the private one's got all the ideas and the public one's like, okay, yeah, I definitely want that, right? You want to be certain that you get it, right? I Google stuff that I don't even care about, just because I want to know. Like if a question comes up and I don't know the answer, I just want to know, right? We all value certainty. And I would say this, most of us, we value certainty for two reasons. One, it gives us security, and the other, it gives us control. We feel safer in knowing. We feel safer in feeling like we can predict or anticipate what's coming next in our life. And we feel more in control when we feel like we have certainty. We feel more in control when we feel like we know everything that there is to know. I'll say this too, the area of faith is no exception to this, right? Like if you're going to build your life on something, if you're going to believe in something, you want to know, right? You want to know that what you believe in is true. You want to know that it's valid. You want to know that it's right, and you don't want to know you want to know, you don't want to build your life on something that doesn't fully line up or fully hold water, right? So you want to be sure, you want to be certain, right? And you want to feel I would even say, in control, maybe even a little bit of your own faith journey as well. I can say this, because of that, especially over the last few hundred years, the church at large has gravitated towards certainty. The church at large has gravitated even towards the idea of, I would say, absolute certainty. The idea that we can know everything that there is to know to the last detail, right? We want to know everything that we could possibly know and be sure about every little thing, right? The church has kind of gravitated towards absolute certainty, which is understandable, but it does come with a couple of costs. The first one is this, unity. In fact, I'd say the need for absolute certainty leads to disunity, especially within the church, right? Here's why. Because when you feel like you've got to know every little thing, or when you feel like you're absolutely certain about every tiny little detail, you know who you can't stand to be in the room with? Somebody who is absolutely certain that they know every tiny little detail as well, just that their tiny little details don't quite line up with your tiny little details, right? And that's not just true in faith, but it's also true in faith, right? Which is why we have 45,000 Christian denominations in the worldwide church. Because along the way, 45,000 people decided that they had it right to the nth degree, and they had figured it out, and that because of that, they couldn't share the same church together. So which one is right? The one we're a part of course. I mean, come on. Right? But absolute certainty it's understandable, but it comes with a few expenses. One, it comes at the expense of unity, right? You can't share faith, you can't share community with someone who doesn't fully believe exactly the same things you do, right? That's one. The second expense is this. The need for absolute certainty rejects curiosity. The need for absolute certainty, to know to the finest detail, right? Rejects any kind of curiosity within the faith journey. We've seen this multiple times throughout the history of the church. In fact, back a few hundred years ago in 1616, the largest denomination at the time felt like they had a lot of things figured out, right? And so they issued this decree in 1616 saying that heliocentrism was a form of heresy. Now, some of you are like, helio what? Right? Heliocentrism, the idea or the belief that the earth, or the world, the universe, I should say, the universe revolves around the sun. Heliocentrism. They said, no, we believe in geocentrism. The whole universe revolves around the earth. And so they said, heliocentrism, the idea that the earth or the universe revolved around the sun was heresy, it was heretical. So an astronomer named Galileo, many of you have heard of him, right? Had started doing his own study, also started studying some astronomers who had come before him. And he started publishing some papers that kind of advocated, at least lightly nodded to the idea of heliocentrism, the idea that the universe might actually revolve around the sun and the earth might actually revolve around the sun. In 1632, he was brought before the church, right? He was put on trial. The trial lasted less than a day. And he was convicted of heresy for espousing that the earth revolved around the sun. He was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. He died in 1642 under house arrest for this belief. And do you know what the church used as their basis for his charge of being guilty of heresy? They used verses like this one. It says, "The world is established, it shall never be moved." Right? Totally stripped it of literary style, totally stripped it of context. Good thing people don't do that anymore, right? Sorry. I'm supposed to behave today. Right? They just pulled it all aside and said, no, we're absolutely certain based on this. Right? Guy was put in house arrest, died under house arrest. A few hundred years later, a friend who, some of you have heard me share this story a little bit, a friend who grew up within the local church, a friend who grew up hearing all of the answers, a friend who went to a 4-year Bible college and got a degree, a friend who graduated college and took his family to church and did all the normal Christian good things, right? And then himself started studying science. And he was reading some things and some scientific literature that kind of pushed against some of the things that he had learned in church, and he didn't know what to do with that. And he found his faith kind of disrupted a bit by some of the things he was learning in science. And he was just trying to explore it all and figure it out and reconcile it all and make sense of it all. And so he did what I think a lot of people would do. He went to a small group, every week like he normally did. And he started asking some of the questions that he had, from his studies and kind of bringing some of this stuff up. And, people kind of like dodge it a little bit. They wouldn't quite engage it. They kind of like, deflect and try to move the conversation back in a different direction. But he kept kind of bringing his questions to the table in that space. And after a few weeks of that, his group leaders kind of pulled him aside one day. They said, hey, come here, we got to talk about something. I said, Nate, we don't ask questions like that here. And so for the last time, he walked out of his church. But he took his questions with him. And he found places that would engage those questions. He found places that would give him thoughts and answers and perspective. And ultimately, he disengaged from faith and from connection with his local church. Right? Many of you know people like that. Maybe they didn't ask those questions quite as directly. But you know people who maybe grew up in church, maybe grew up in the same church you do. A lot of you have friends who grew up right next to you, going to the same camps that you went to and the same retreats that you went to and making the same decisions that you made. And they went to college, they started experiencing life, and some of the things that they thought they believed, they found were kind of butting against the life that they were experiencing or the things that they were learning. And they didn't know what to do with those moments. They didn't know what to do with those questions. They didn't know what to do with those things. And ultimately, they just kind of said, I don't know that this is a space for those kinds of questions. And so they slipped and drifted and stepped away and found other spaces to do life in. Some of you grew up in churches that made absolute certainty kind of the hallmark, or I would even say the definition of faith. I remember growing up, in church, and we would have these guest preachers who would come in sometimes, right? Guest preachers would come in, and a lot of them would come in, they would ask the question in a very specific way. They would ask this about my faith. They would say, hey, do you know that you know that you know? I'd be like, it was like, hey, like they would talk about do you know that you know that you're saved? Or do you know that you know that you know that you're going to heaven? Do you know that you know that you know? Like, are you absolutely certain? And I'd be like, I thought I knew. I don't know, I don't know if I know that I know, and I don't know if I know that I know that I know. Really, I don't really know what all this means. So it's just kind of crazy. Like, you go like, I don't know what to do with that. But you were kind of taught, some of us were kind of taught that absolute certainty was the definition of faith. I grew up in spaces, sometimes this guest preachers would come in, they'd also ask questions like this. Hey, do you know beyond the shadow of a doubt? As if doubt was the complete enemy of faith. And if you had even the tiniest bit of this, you certainly couldn't have faith. Do you know beyond the shadow, even the slightest inkling of a doubt? Which led many of us to grow up with a faith or with a context of church that made us feel like the last thing that you can say when it comes to your faith, the last thing you can say when someone asks you a question about what you believe, the last thing you could say were these three words: I don't know. Huh? And a lot of us were given this idea that feeling certain about everything was the hallmark of faith. Right? Which is hard because you can't say, in a culture like that, you can't say when you're struggling to believe. When you're in life circumstance and you wake up one morning and you go, God, I don't know where you're at right now. God, what are you doing? God, why aren't you showing up in the way that I expected you to show up? You can't say it. Right? So there's a couple problems that come with this approach to faith. A couple problems that come with absolute certainty. One is for us and one is for the church at large. The one for us is this: a faith based entirely on what you know has no room to grow. The moment you feel like you've got it all figured out is the day that you are done growing deeper in your relationship with your Creator. Faith based on entirely on what you know has no room to grow. Second problem is this: it's more for the church at large. A church based on absolute certainty leaves no room for those who aren't so sure. And when we make absolute certainty the hallmark or the definition of faith, what we do is we communicate to people in the room who are like, I'm still figuring this out. I'm not so sure about this. Man, I don't know. What we communicate to them is, hey, this isn't a space for you. This isn't a space that you can say, I don't know, right? A church based on absolute certainty leaves no room for those who aren't so sure. So for followers of Jesus, for those of us in the room who consider ourselves followers of Jesus, right? Obviously, we ought to be asking ourselves, like, hey, what does Jesus expect from us in our faith journey? What does he expect from us in the area of certainty? And I'd even offer this to you this morning, that Jesus' earliest followers weren't as certain as we like to think that they were. We're going to talk about that this morning. We're going to dive into a text known as the Gospel of Matthew. It's known as Matthew's account of the life and the happenings of Jesus. And Matthew takes time to detail many of Jesus' teachings. He details how Jesus actually talked about his own impending death on the cross. He talks about how Jesus actually kind of predicted his own resurrection and say, hey, I'm going to die, but in 3 days I'll rise again. And he talks about how Jesus actually did die and actually did rise from the dead. And he tells us about the earliest disciples' response to that moment, the response of people who had spent 3 years watching Jesus do miracles, heal the sick, walk on water, the response to those individuals, his earliest followers, to Jesus after his resurrection. So Matthew tells us about a couple of women who, after Jesus' death, go to visit his grave. And Matthew tells us that when they go to visit his grave, there's an earthquake, and an angel appears, and Jesus isn't there. An angel appears to them and tells them to go and tell the disciples what's happened. And this is where we'll pick up with Matthew's thoughts. Matthew says to us, these two women departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell Jesus' disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. I always love that. Greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. It says, then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. So now it's kind of a rendezvous point. And we're going to meet up in Galilee. So Matthew tells us that the 11 went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. So there, and then Jesus shows up, right? And when they saw him, immediate response, they worshiped him, which is a natural and perfect and excellent response. They worshiped him. They put him in a position of lordship. They likely bowed down or kneeled down in this moment, right? The way the text reads, it actually reads as if Jesus is approaching them, and as they see him coming, their immediate response is one of faith, and one of belief, and one of excitement and expectation and gratefulness and worship, right, to Jesus, putting him in a place, in a position of lordship. Their immediate response, they worshiped him. But then Matthew tells us about another response that they also had, a simultaneous response. It's a response that he captures in three simple but incredibly clear words that often, if we read too fast, we read right over and we miss. Because Matthew says that they worshiped him. And then he immediately goes on to tell us, and some doubted. Translators debate this text a little bit. Some translators say, hey, this should be translated, but they doubted, to be more all-inclusive, right, of the disciples. Matthew tells us at least some doubted. So I begs the question, like, how do they hold both at the same time? How do these disciples find themselves worshiping Jesus and also doubting Jesus simultaneously? And other gospels tell us about moments of doubt, right? Like Mark tells us about the disciples' response when one of these two women, Mary Magdalene, comes and tells them that Jesus is risen. Their immediate response is doubt. They don't believe her. Right? Luke tells us about Jesus actually previously rebuking the disciples at one point for their doubt and saying, hey, you doubted me, right? The Gospel of John tells us about Thomas. Many of you are familiar with doubting Thomas, right? That phrase, doubting Thomas, comes from one of the disciples who had a kind of a high level of doubt and said, hey, I got to put my hand in his side before I'm going to believe, right? And then standing here on this hill, watching Jesus approach them, they find themselves responding both in worship but also with doubt. This word doubt in the Greek literally means to duplicate. To duplicate. It's almost as if to read like, to think twice about something. To see Jesus approaching and respond with both worship and then also process all of that over again a second time and go, what is going on here? I don't quite know what I think about this. Which is a piece of many of your and my journey. Thinking twice, right? Many of us find ourselves falling in love with Jesus and finding ourselves in a deep relationship with Jesus. And then a season later, finding yourself thinking twice and going, I don't know where Jesus is right now in my life. I'm missing Jesus in this moment of my life. A life event happens, a circumstance happens, you discover something, you're trying to figure something out. You go, I don't quite know where he is, right? Like you believed in Jesus. It's not that you lost belief, but you also found yourself going, I'm unsure about some things in this moment. Some of the churches that some of us grew up in might have even said, like, oh, if you were doing that, you were probably backsliding, right? Or you stopped believing, or you never really believed in the first place, right? But Jesus' earliest disciples find themselves immediately responding and go, hey, we're putting Jesus in a position of lordship, and also, what is going on? Finding themselves both combined with worship and doubt. Which also makes me kind of ask this question or offer this question, right? Like, how do we get the text in the first place? How do we get these three words and all these words, particularly these three words, in the text in the first place? Because it's not like Matthew, it's the Gospel of Matthew. So it's not like Matthew was just sitting there on a hill that day with a pen and a paper, scratching everything down as it happens in real time, right? Most scholars believe the Gospel of Matthew was written about 50 years after the life of Jesus, right? Many people believe that it was written either by Matthew or someone who may have studied closely under Matthew or closely studied Matthew's teachings and captured the gospel according to Matthew. 50 years after the life of Jesus, which means that for 50 years, the disciples were talking about these moments. And when they talked about these moments, they didn't just talk about their moments of worship, they talked about their moments of doubt. In fact, I'd say it this way, Jesus' earliest followers were honest about their doubt. But many of us today find ourselves struggling, to be honest, about the moments that we're not so sure about. Finding ourselves struggling to be fully open about the times or the seasons of our life where we're going, I'm not quite sure where God is right now. Would we feel less qualified? Maybe we were given a version of faith that told us that, hey, to question or doubt or not be quite so sure about what's happening in a season or a moment with God is to lack faith altogether, right? But Jesus' earliest followers were honest about their moments, their times, and their seasons of doubt. And the ways that they at times held doubt simultaneously with worship hand in hand. So you'd think that Jesus would respond to these disciples in a certain way, right? You'd think that he would kind of speak to them as he approaches with a certain tone, or a certain mindset, or a certain teaching, or hey, let me just resolve all of that doubt for you in this moment. So let's take a look at how Jesus responds. Matthew tells us that Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And so go away, you stupid disciples who can't believe in me fully." Nah, that's fun. He says, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. You who worship me and also find yourself thinking twice. You who have put me in a position of lordship but also find yourself doubting a bit. You, go and make disciples. Go and expand my kingdom. Go and share my teachings with others in this world, particularly with all nations," which could probably be more accurately translated to Gentiles. It's literally how the Greek reads, to Gentiles, which is, many of you have heard this phrase or this term, right? Gentiles. And throughout the New Testament, you hear of two groups of people, kind of primarily with kind of like a binary perspective, right? Gentiles and Jewish people. So Jewish people would have been those who were obviously Jews before Jesus, right? And then some of them continued following Judaism while also following Jesus. And then Gentiles would have been people who were disconnected from Judaism altogether. Many of them were polytheistic, had some version of pagan faith, had tons of questions. They were constantly searching, trying to figure out. They would create new gods at different times, trying to figure out what faith was, right? And this is actually a shift in Jesus' ministry, because most of Jesus' ministry on earth was primarily focused on Jews and the redemption of the Jewish people. In fact, Jesus at one point said, "I have come for the lost sheep of Israel." And he said that to someone who's not one of those lost sheep in that moment. And so now Jesus is shifting and saying, hey, the faith that I brought to the Jewish people now is going to go out to the world. Now is going to go out to those who know the least about me. And I'm going to do it through you. With all of your worship and your acknowledgement of the things that you're not so sure about, I'm going to do it through you. Go and make disciples. Or maybe even just say it this way, that Jesus called a group of people with honest faith to reach those who knew the least about him. Not a group of people who acted like they knew everything and had it all figured out. Not a group of people who felt like they had it perfect. Not a group of people who were sure that they were sure, or knew that they knew that they knew that they knew. But a group of people with honest faith. A group of people who could say, hey, we're putting Jesus in a position of lordship. We're orienting our life around the way of Jesus. We're following Jesus' teachings. We believe in Jesus, and also we're still figuring this thing out. And also there have been moments that we were still unsure about Jesus, and also there were moments we were worshiping him and doubting him at the same time. A group of people with honest faith who could be open about their questions, who could be open about the things that they weren't sure about in the midst of the things that they were sure and certain about. He calls a people of honest faith to reach those who knew the least about him. And so it is with us today. Can I tell you what I dream of and hope for our church? We're going to do a lot of things. We're going to be a lot of things. We're going to try a lot of things. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to screw some stuff. We're going to throw noodles at the wall, and some of them are going to fall and drop, right? The thing I hope most for our church is that we would be a group of people who could do two things. Yeah, a group of people who could do two things. One, a group of people who could be honest with each other in the moments that we're struggling in our own faith. A group of people who say, hey, it's okay to show up at group. It's okay to show up on Sunday. It's okay to show up over coffee and go, hey, I'm not sure what I think about this right now. I'm trying to find God in this circumstance, but I'm struggling to see him right now. And also a group of people who looks at the world around us and says, hey, it's okay to not be sure. It's okay to not have it all figured out. And yet this is a space and a place for you. It's okay to walk in the door and go, I don't know what I believe about all this, but I'm here just to kind of try some things or explore some things. I'm just curious about some things. A place where it's okay to show up to small group and go, have someone go, hey, I'm just searching things out. I don't know what I believe about all this. I'm really not quite sure about this. I used to believe some of these things, and now I struggle to believe some of these things. A space where it's okay to say some of those things and journey together in that. So I'd kind of say it this way. You can go back a slide real quick. Let's go back a slide, Sarah. That we will be a people of honest faith, right? Creating space for others to explore faith honestly. Maybe a simpler way to say that, you've seen it, right? Is that we will be a church for people with questions of faith. And here's the secret around that. Here's just like the thing you probably ought to know, or I hope you can acknowledge. When we say that we'll be a church for people with questions of faith, that's all of us. That's all of us. Because all of us find ourselves in seasons where we go, I don't know what God is up to right now. I'm not quite sure where he is. And if you're the most committed and lifelong follower of Jesus, right? Like you might find yourself in that moment going, I'm still putting him in a position of lordship. I'm still worshiping him. I'm still choosing to put my trust and my faith in him. But I'm also really unsure about what he's up to and what's going on and where he's going to show up in my life right now. That's all of us. Many of you have friends who walked out of church or disconnected from church or wouldn't walk into a church because they felt like this couldn't be them. They felt like they couldn't bring their questions to that table. They felt like it wasn't okay to not be sure. I'm just saying around the gate, hey, we will be a church for people with questions of faith. To build that church, I said this, to build that church, it takes a whole lot more than me just standing on a stage talking about it for 35 minutes. To build that kind of church, it takes a group of people committed to that kind of church. Committed to being a place of honesty and openness for people walking in the doors for the first time, going, hey, I'm trying to figure out what all of this means. Hey, I'm not so sure about some of this. I'm not so sure about any of this, right? To be a church that's willing to sit down and engage with the hard questions and not just throw darts or greeting card theology at complex questions, but to actually sit and process and create space and hold space for those questions and to look at someone and go, hey, I can help you with that. Or sometimes even to go, hey, I don't know either. But let's explore that together. And let's figure that out together. You want to know one of the things, if you're for the longtime follower of Jesus, you want to know one of the things that will propel your faith forward faster than so many other things? It's putting yourself in relationship and proximity to someone who doesn't believe what you believe and has all the questions, right? Because you'll find them asking you questions that you don't know the answer to, and your immediate response might be embarrassment. And I would say your immediate response ought to be some level of excitement, because now you get to grow in your journey with Jesus too. And someone like that will disrupt your faith in the best of ways. They'll cause you to question things that you've never questioned before, or ask things that you've never asked before, or recognize things that you never really even knew, right? And go, how can we figure this out together, right? But that kind of a church takes all of us. Quite honestly, I think the church we're building, or the people we're building this church for, what they need most is you, creating your space in your life for them. Well, they need more than to come in and hear me talk for a half hour, right? What they need most is to meet you in a stupid discussion question or over a donut in the lobby, right? We don't have to buy those donuts because you might not eat breakfast. We buy those donuts so that you can talk to people and connect and meet people, right? And with the people we're here for, what they need most is a connection with you. And a version of you that's willing to create space for them and go, hey, let's figure some things out together. So let me say this. said at the beginning, every new season, right, comes with questions. But also this, every new season is an opportunity for new commitment. Every new season is an opportunity for each of us to step back and go, hey, how committed am I, and what's my role in this? And how can I play a part in building the church that my community needs, the church that my friends need, the church that some of our family needs? How can I play a role and be a part in that? And so here's what I'm going to ask you to do over the course of this series. I'm going to ask you, we're going to talk a lot about who we're for. We're going to talk to you a lot about the kind of church that we're building together. But I'm going to ask you over the course of the series, not just to sit and consume and listen and take in. I'm going to ask you over the course of the series to process and pray, particularly if you call this church your home. I'm going to ask you to process and pray, hey, what role would God have me to play in building this church? And we're going to come to this end of this series on February 25th, last week of the series. We're going to have what we're calling Commitment Sunday. That's a really lame name for something. I just didn't know what else to call it. So we're calling it Commitment Sunday. I don't know, some bash? I don't know, it doesn't matter, right? We'll call it Commitment Sunday, right? And here's all that is. It's an opportunity for those of us who call this church home to say, hey, as we move into a new season, I've taken time to process. I've taken time to pray. I've taken time to think. I've taken time to go, hey, how might God use me in this season? And what might my role be? So we've got these cards that we're actually going to give you on the way out the door. It's just called a partnership card. Again, nothing special. I just didn't know what else to call it, so we'll call it a partnership card, right? The reason we're going to give you these cards, it's really not for us. It's really for you. Because I want you to take, particularly if you call this church your home, I want you to take seriously this month and go, hey, how would God have me to partner? Not with Ryan. How would God have me to partner with the other people in this room to build the church that God would have us to build in this next season? I'm asking you to take this card. I'm asking you to put it on your fridge, maybe in your Bible, depending on, if that's the place you put stuff to remember stuff. Wherever you can put this, that's going to remind you to pray and process and go, God, how would you have me to commit? Right? I'm asking you to put it in that spot. I'm going to ask you to pray about it. I'm going to ask you every day, right? At least 3-4 times a week to go, God, how would you use me in this season? How would you have me to commit to being a part of this next season in the life of your church?